There's a fascinating comparison to be made between the Romans' love of gladiatorial combat and our own love of football. In the history of how these two forms of entertainment become popular, in what they say about Roman identity, American identity, and also what they suggest about the kind of human cost of these two extraordinarily popular forms of sport. For gladiatorial combat for the Romans is something that is almost inseparable from the Romans' idea of who they are, and there's a good reason for that, is that the Romans were a warrior society. They were farmers and they were warriors. That was what defined them. And in the early days of the Roman Republic, when the Romans were constantly fighting for new territory so that they could expand and feed their growing population, war was a necessity. The month of March is called March because that's the month when you would march out on, it's called after the god of war, Mars. So you would march out into battle, you'd planted your crops, you'd go and you'd make war, and then you'd come home and you'd harvest and you'd reap the benefits of that. Gladiatorial combat was in many ways a stylized version of this normal activity. The difference, of course, is that as the empire grows, as armies become professionalized, it's no longer important for the average Roman citizen farmer to fight in the army, and in fact, it becomes unnecessary for this to happen. As Roman territory expands, it comes to include vast resources of fighting men, and so therefore the necessity for the average Roman to actually engage in military activity is lessened. And so gladiatorial combat becomes in many ways a proxy for this kind of virile, manly Roman behavior. The problem, of course, is that gladiators are not Romans. They are unfree. The reason that they are gladiators is because they are slaves. They are captured in battle. They are the warriors of another culture in most cases. They can be Romans in the sense that Romans could become slaves by being sold into slavery for debt, or indeed your father in Roman law has the right to sell you into slavery if he wants to. So there are people who are ethnically Roman who are fighting as gladiators, but for the most part these people are slaves. And so what the Romans are watching when they go to their massive colosseums that are purpose-built structures to enclose gladiatorial combat is they're essentially watching a certain class of people play out the fantasy of what it means to be a Roman. And if you yourself are no longer able or necessary to fight wars in Germany or wars in Asia, you can go to your Colosseum and you can see that spectacle enacted there. And indeed, often the Romans would enact real historical battles from the Roman past as a way of, again, celebrating that sort of patriotic identity. Football in our own country began in the Ivy League. It was an elite sport. It was invented at Yale and then taken up at Harvard, as far as I know. And so it was the young men, well-born young men of very, very powerful aristocratic families who invented a sport that was essentially capturing a certain kind of, again, ideal of manliness, an older kind of warrior combat that was actually becoming, that after the Civil War was obsolete. I mean, the Civil War is a mechanized modern war, and therefore the battle is no longer a heroic romantic thing. It's a dirty and disgusting and a bloody thing. And so there's a lot of nostalgia for an older medieval or Roman past when you, with your bare hands, encountered an equal opponent and you duked it out together, on the field of battle. And so football was a way of emulating that. And early football, if you've seen the photos, was played with almost no equipment whatsoever, and little helmets of leather. I mean, there was almost no protection for the body. Football becomes, as many people have argued, industrialized or mechanized in a certain kind of way. That is, it's played on a field in a grid against the clock. So there are certain features of football which take on the contours contours of the Industrial Revolution or of the 20th century. But at its heart is this idea of you know, mano-a-mano combat between warriors. And of course, as in the Romans' culture, it becomes a proxy for real fighting. It would be wonderful to study, are there, you know, does football become more popular in times of war, less popular? In other words, as we go into periods of real conflict in American history, what happens in our interest in this sort of proxy, pretend conflict? Another thing I'll point to as a point of comparison, of course, is we might want to think about the human cost of these sports. Gladiatorial combat was very obviously a blood sport. People weren't intended to die. That was the whole point. The Romans took a lot of pleasure in that. We don't necessarily take the same kind of pleasure in the pain of others on the field, but football is very obviously meant to be a dangerous sport. That's why people watch it. In fact, rules have been changed to make it more dangerous. And that's what draws the massive crowds to the Super Bowl, which again, why is it a bowl? It's a Roman Colosseum. It's being fought in a bowl for this reason. The Super Bowl is a wonderful example of this because of the danger, because of the elemental masculinity that is on display in the Super Bowl. It's no longer even just about that display. It's about the whole economic, the various economic infrastructure within football, within which football is enclosed. And again, that would be true for the Romans as well, that there would have been souvenirs that were attached to particular kind of gladiators. There would have been entire economies that revolved around the Colosseum, not just the workers who built Colosseums, but of course the people who supplied the concessions, prostitution around the Colosseum, you know, Roman equivalent of nightclubs that would spring up at these times. So again, we see that these forms of sporting combat generate a whole cultural and economic complex of activities, it would be hard to imagine how you could remove the spectacle that is at the center of these things without removing this entire structure that's built on top of them and that we all value so much as part of our own identity. Even if you're someone who doesn't really watch the Super Bowl, you're still interested in the commercials, for example. So how could you take away the Super Bowl without taking away what is, you know, for advertisers, for pundits, for the average American, a source of extraordinary pleasure and profit? But again, at the heart of this is, you know, the problem that's becoming more apparent to even intense lovers of the game of football, which is that it's costing lives. And as we get more information about the dangers that inevitably occur, even when football players are very well protected from injury on the field, we're seeing that many former football players are suffering massive trauma because of concussions that were undiagnosed. Are these things that we are going to be able to fix so that the game can become safer for those who play it? But if it's safer for those who play it, are people still going to want to watch it? Are we moving toward a world in which, like in ancient Rome, the people who play football will become an underclass or taken from an unfree underclass of people and coerced into playing this game, even though it's very, very dangerous? I mean, these are really, really important. These are really, really important questions.